to another edition of BullionStar Perspectives. My name is Ronan Manley, and today we're honoured to have as a guest Willem Middelkoop, who is the well-known author of The Big Reset and various other books on the financial system, and he is the founder and manager of the Commodity Discovery Fund. Hi William, welcome. You're very welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, and I think probably there hasn't been a better time really to discuss what we're going to discuss today, because with geopolitical events and the financial system, monetary events happening at a rapid pace, even in real time, what we're going to discuss will probably be changing over the next few weeks. So I think it's probably good to start off with looking at what's going on in Ukraine with the invasion of Russia and which has triggered the Western sanctions. And how does that really relate to commodity prices and literally the availability of commodities going forward? Because you're a specialist and a keen observer of the commodity markets.
We always warned, actually, we warned for years that we were on the verge of reaching an era in which we would see shortages of raw materials, shortages of commodities in many areas. And we also warned about the debasement of currency and the money printing. And then people always said, but look, there's no inflation and it's different nowadays. And now it almost seems like the start of the war in Ukraine was actually the starting signal for a runaway inflation. Of course, we've seen inflation start to heat up after the Corona crisis in March 2020, after which central banks started to print insane amounts of money and sending checks, that's helicopter money, to all people in the US. But now in the last few weeks, after the start of this war in Ukraine, we see some very, very dangerous spikes, not only in energy prices, but this week we saw some huge spikes in palladium, in nickel, in wheat. And I think the cat is out of the bag now. And I call this superinflation. It's inflation of 10% or more, yearly inflation of 10% or more. And once these prices start to rise and investors are starting to get nervous and investors start to flee from bonds towards hard assets and all the government can't print, you have a very serious problem.
I know that you use that term superinflation, could be inflation in the double digits. Do you think that now in the official inflation figures, for example, the US CPI and the PPI, we're going to start seeing double digits?
Oh, we already see the double digit. If you look at the German PPI, so that's the producer price index, it was up 25% last month. And last week we got a number of almost 30%. So that's high in the double digits. And even without energy, the PPI in Germany without energy was 12%. So it's not only energy. And I think we're in this positive feedback loop now, which is actually a very negative feedback loop, that people have to start raising the salaries, and governments are starting to discuss to give extra subsidies to their citizens to handle the higher energy bills. But this means more money printing. So you have this very dangerous spiral in which inflation really can start to heat up a bit more, especially when a war is raging in the Ukraine.
And I think it's interesting that as well as a military conflict, behind the scenes there's an equally aggressive economic and financial war happening, with the Western sanctions excluding a number of Russian banks from SWIFT, and also with Visa and MasterCard, for example, blocking Russian citizens using those cards. So it's really forcing Russia away from SWIFT and towards maybe the Chinese CIPS system, and also as regards the Visa and MasterCard blocks. I think it was just yesterday, Russia announced that it's going to be using Chinese Union Pay. So really these sanctions are forcing the alliance, accelerating the alliance between Russia and China. Would you agree?
Yeah, the divide between East and West has been a concern for me for many years. When I wrote the big reset in 2013, was published 2014, in February 2014. In the epilogue, I wrote that it's not that difficult to have a monetary reset, to find a successor for the dollar, to have debt restructurings, when you can find agreement among the main trading blocks in the world. But you need cooperation between the West and the East, especially China. And now China, I warned in the epilogue, when you can't have that agreement, you can have a war started, because the tension, the possible tension between the East and the West is enormous. And now China is not willing to join the West in sanctions for Russia. And Russia is driven more and more into the arms of China, just like we've seen in 2014, 2015, after the revolution in Kiev. You get a very dangerous Eastern Bloc, which is totally opposed to the Western Bloc. And then things can get very messy. And then it will become very hard to work on a joint monetary reset needed to solve some major problems within the architecture of this financial system.
You probably saw that the sanctions are also targeting the Bank of Russia, central bank's currency reserves, the majority of which will be in US dollar, euro, assets, pounds. And when you exclude those, all you're really left with is the renminbi currency reserves and gold. So do you think that this conflict is really forcing that hand as well? Is that going to accelerate the use of gold by the Bank of Russia?
Well, you can say that Russia actually has been preparing for this moment of huge Western sanctions for years, because if you study the behavior by the Russian central bank, they stopped buying US treasuries around 2011. They started to sell a lot of treasuries around 2013, and they sold almost all of them in the last few years. And they started to rebuild their gold holdings shortly after the Lehman crisis in 2009, just like China. And Russia has built an enormous amount of physical gold holdings, as you know, and reported about. And this is a very clear sign that state actors like Russia are very interested to hold assets without any third-party risk. And I always advise our high net worth clients, they should limit the number of doors between themselves and assets as much as possible. And when you hold physical gold or silver, there's not one door between you and your assets. And it always surprised me how state actors like the Russian central bank and the Chinese central bank, and actually we've seen around 25 central banks buying physical gold in the last few years. Even Hungary, Poland, and Ireland have been adding to their physical gold reserves. So that's a sign, and I think that will increase that trend as well.
And what about, there's a theory going around about if Russia started accepting gold for oil payments, that a lot of sovereigns and governments and central banks would have to buy even more gold physical to use as that currency to buy oil, which would force the price of, well, it would literally increase the demand for physical and maybe break the fractional reserve, COMEX futures and London unallocated. Do you think that there's a chance that Russia will say that countries can buy oil for gold?
There are very few things Russia can do now. And in a way, they are cornered financially, economically. And by introducing their own gold standard, by connecting the price of oil to gold, it could be a move to find a way out. But you shouldn't forget that I think China is a very influential partner of Russia in the background. So this won't happen without a Chinese backing. And I think it would be much more successful when China and Russia would create something together. But I don't have any information that they are working on that. But I do know, when I was doing the research for the Big Reset, I do know that China was looking at all kind of scenarios in which a successor for the dollar could be introduced. Of course, we have the SDR, the currency basket by the IMF. The renminbi was added as a fifth currency in 2015, so the SDR could be upgraded to a world reserve currency. But China also asked to study what would happen if you add gold to the SDR, to the currency basket, and gold would become the sixth currency, and then the SDR would become gold-linked or gold-backed, as you wish. And those are very interesting scenarios, of which we know that China has been looking into that. So China is very aware of the power of gold being the eternal form of hard currency. But I don't have any clear indication that they will bring a gold-backed currency to the market together with Russia anytime soon. But it could happen. Yeah, it could happen.
Did you see the remarks by the US Fed Chairman Powell when he referred to, I think in a Senate hearing, about the fact that he conceded that the global reserve currency, the US, could in time diminish its status and that there could be room for two global reserve currencies? Was he referring implicitly to China with those remarks?
I think the US, the Federal Reserve, reached a point that they no longer can't ignore the facts that the dollar is in its last phase as the main world reserve currency. And I could only publish the Big Reset because there's quite a bit amount of research available in academic circles pointing towards a multi-reserve currency system. I'm also a member of the advisory board of the OMFIF, which is a monetary think tank in London, who has published quite a bit on this topic. And a few years ago, the Federal Reserve in the US always said, no, we support a strong dollar policy, and they weren't afraid about the end of the status for the dollar as the world reserve currency. But we've seen a very interesting speech a few years ago, almost 3 years ago now, where Mark Carney, as the bank governor of the Central Bank of England, he gave a lunch presentation in Jackson Hole calling for an end of the dollar and really asking the world to think about a successor for the dollar. And he has pointed to it could be a digital, synthetic world currency. So behind the scenes, there's quite a bit of discussion about this topic for years. And I think Powell's remarks were the first in public pointing towards the position of the US that they could support such a move.
I read your book back in 2014. You actually sent me a copy to my home, which was great because I had a chance to read it straight from the author. And back then, people were talking about the book a lot and a monetary reset, and it was known as the Big Reset. But then, more recently, came along the World Economic Forum with the Great Reset. How would you describe the difference between what your vision of a major reset and the monetary system and what they refer to as the Great Reset?
Well, I told you about the academic circles in which studies were published about the need to find or to bring this monetary system towards a new phase. Monetary historians know that every 70, 80, 90 years, you normally see the start of a new world reserve currency. We used to have the pound sterling in the 19th century, then we had the era of the dollar in the 20th century. So this has been talked about quite a bit, also in Davos, also with the World Economic Forum and by Klaus Schwab. So Klaus Schwab has been using the reset term quite a bit in the last few years. But I was surprised to see the publication of his book, The Great Reset, on the corona pandemic, being published only 4 couple of years after the pandemic started. And he touches on a little bit more than my financial monetary reset, in which the world's financial system is being brought to another level. And his great reset, it covers some more topics. So it's a little wider in its approach.
When I was thinking about the big reset after reading your book, I have to admit, I thought that the reset would be an event where you'd wake up one day and all the central banks would announce in unison that they had either made gold an anchor of the system or revalued gold in some way. But the more I look at it now, it looks like a reset is a process rather than an event, something that starts and maybe the markets don't realize it's happening until it's got to a certain point, and then suddenly everybody agrees that it is a reset. Is that the way you look at it? It's a process more than an event.
Yeah, well, by calling my book The Big Reset, I've been also a little bit helpful to telegraph to the world that a reset is like a binary event which happens during one day. And I think you're correct when you say the reset process can take years, but there should always, of course, be one day in which the central banks have to make public that from tomorrow on, the oil and commodity prices won't be calculated and priced in dollars, but maybe in another currency. So that would be technically the monetary reset point, like we had one August 15, 1971, and like we had one in Bretton Woods in 1944. But I think you're correct. We're in a process, and that's what Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum always tells as well. We reached a point in time in which the old institutions, which have been built since the end of the Second World War, like the IMF and the World Bank, they don't fulfill their job that well. And the World Economic Forum is always pointing towards we have to build new systems now. And new systems, that could be monetary system, but it could be other systems as well. For example, if you start with the universal basic income, or if you start with a world wealth tax, a special wealth tax, or a special climate bill or climate tax. So behind the scenes, the powers that be are openly discussing all these kind of ideas, and it's not sure yet when we will see them roll out these new systems. But you can expect a lot to change within the next 5 to 10 years, and maybe sooner.
And who do you think is behind the scenes in a very influential way, making this process happen? Would it be like the BIS, the G30, or the shadowy elites, the banking elite? Really, is there somebody pulling the strings, or is it an internationally coordinated realization that there's been an agreement that there will be new systems, either monetary or more widely?
Well, to answer that question, you have to study history. And if you study history, you can learn that the main power, the main economic power is most of the time in charge of designing the new phase of the monetary system. And it often happens after a war, like it happened after the Second World War. The ideas which were proposed by the US in Bretton Woods, they had been working on those plans at the US Treasury since 1942. So I never agree with the people who think there's one guy on top and he's pulling all those strings. Yeah. Whether it's Rockefeller or Rothschild, I don't believe these stories. But of course, there is a business elite, and we know that from history books. And this elite and some rich and famous and wealthy families have been powerful for 200, 300, 400 of years. And we know that here in Europe, you have the royal families, and the royal families, they meet the big corporations in Davos and during Bilderberg. So there is an inner circle, and the inner circle often is planning in advance. I think it's also almost their responsibility to plan in advance, but often they work on plans which are very supportive for their own club and maybe are good for a number of people, but sometimes, and we see that in the current organization of the World Economic Forum as well, if you look at their sponsors, you see all these huge corporations, and we've seen it during the Corona crisis as well. The Pfizers of this world, they made so much money, and the smaller companies, the SME companies, they went broke in the Corona crisis. So there is an elite. There is a powerful elite, bankers, central bankers, private bankers, royal families. The history shows they work together.
You might have seen, I wrote an article a few years ago about the reset planned in advance. And it was based on just a few figures that I happened to see a pattern in about gold repatriation by the Bundesbank and the Austrian Central Bank. And they wanted to have that repatriation completed before 2020. And it turns out they did it ahead of schedule. But I remember BullionStar went to the World Money Fair in Berlin in 2016. And I did a short interview with Luke Chua, who is our CEO, and he asked me about gold repatriation. And I mentioned in passing that I thought that there could be a reset in 2020, and purely based on the repatriation schedules. So my hunch is that some central bankers knew about a timeline or a target date for a reset, or it could be completely coincidence, but that was my contribution to it.
It coincides with the information I published in the Big Reset, because, as I said, I had quite a bit of research in which not 2020 was named specifically, but it was quite clear that when I wrote it in 2013, that they would need at least 5 to 7 years to prepare the system. And I think we have a delay now because the central bank digital currencies will be used in a monetary reset. And as you know, China is the only one which has had a rollout of a central bank digital currency in China. And the US, the Federal Reserve is behind. And I know the ECB is very close to start testing a central bank digital currency. And also, if you look at some other topics, if you look at the buildup of the national debt in the US, is getting unsustainable. Many parts of the financial system, you see trends which are becoming unsustainable. You see with commodity prices now to rise. So something needs to be done. And often the central bankers, the elites, the powers that be, they act when the crisis when the pressure becomes too large. Yeah. And I think the current crisis around the Ukraine could be triggering reset actions in the not too distant future.
So I was going to explore quickly with you about central bank gold reserves and how do they each know that the other has what they claim to have. But I wanted to kind of use an example of the Dutch central bank, the Netherlands Bank, because you're very familiar with that bank and you know a lot of central bankers from Holland are ex-central bankers. So the Netherlands has one of the largest gold reserves in the world, claimed gold reserves, 612 tons, I think in 10th position. But only about 29% is actually held in the Netherlands. It was in Amsterdam and it's currently in Haarlem waiting for a new vault in Zeist. But do you think that the rest of the Netherlands gold, the 69% which isn't in the Netherlands, is actually there in the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England and the Bank of Canada?
Well, that's the same kind of question one could ask to the Bundesbank, to the German central bank. And of course, the same kind of questions were asked to the Bundesbank. And I personally asked some of those questions to the Dutch central bank. And we know from the response, especially from the German case, that it took the Germans 7 years. That was planned. Would take them 7 years to be able to bring back their gold reserves to Germany from New York. Well, if I go on holiday and I give you my gold and silver coins and ask you to look after it, and I return from holiday and I ask my silver coins and my gold coins back, you should be able to hand them right away to me. And if you tell me it will take me a few weeks or months or even years, I know you have sold them and you need to buy them back. So when I heard that the Germans need to wait 7 years to be able to repatriate their national gold holdings, it was quite clear that the US had used those physical reserves in a money game, in a money trick, by selling those ounces several times.
So if there was a monetary reset and gold was the new anchor of the system, or even if gold was one of the SDR currencies, would it be a case where the central banks and sovereigns will just agree amongst themselves that each of them has what they claim to have without doing physical audits? And would it be just then based on a mutual trust system?
I think it's very hard to push the US towards an independent audit of their physical gold holdings. Yes. So I think there's always a matter of trust between central banks. But we know from certain publication that China has really pushed the US to allow China to add to their physical gold holdings for the central bank over a number of years to become competitive in a way with Europe and the US. If you look at the number of ounces each of the countries own relative to the size of their economy, and China was allowed to build a huge physical gold reserve, and even Russia was allowed to build such a reserve. So now all these major trading partners are almost aligned to use these gold holdings. And you could even store them or use a double accounting system and give part of it to the IMF and then use all the official gold holdings worldwide to introduce a new gold-linked or gold-backed currency. And that could be like a digital SDR currency.
So if it does happen in the future, we'll have to keep a keen eye on what each country claims it has and whether they really draw a line under it and say that they're going to net off obligations, and maybe that's how they'll sweep it under the carpet. Would you be able to explain briefly about your commodity discovery fund and what its investment focus is and what holdings it focuses on?
I've been a journalist since 1980, and I worked for Dutch national TV as a market commentator between 2001 and 2008. But when I worked on my first book, which was published in 2007, I became a little nervous about a potential large crisis within the financial system. So when that crisis arrived in 2007, 2008, with the collapse of Lehman, I decided to stop as a journalist and to start to build on two companies. One was a Bullion web shop, just like the ones you are connected with. And I sold that one after 3 years when we reached yearly sales of 100 million. And I kept working as a founder and fund manager with the Commodity Discovery Fund, which I also founded in 2008, because I felt the need myself to be able to invest in natural resource companies, mining companies, exploration companies working on large discoveries in gold and silver, but also copper, nickel, and zinc. So we built the Commodity Discovery Fund as a tool, as an investment fund for retail, high net worth investors to be able to take stakes in Canadian and also Australian mining companies. And we pivoted our investment strategy a bit. And now in the last few years, we fully concentrate on the 100 most significant discoveries in natural resources. So that could be precious metals related, could be base metals related. We have uranium findings and holdings as well. So that's the story of our fund, and we've grown towards 150 million euro, and most of that money comes from almost 2,000 high net worth, mainly Dutch-speaking high net worth clients.
Wow, that's very interesting. I was looking at your website, and I wasn't really aware of the extent to which the fund and the growth of the fund has been phenomenal.
Especially the last 2 years, we've seen real strong inflows. And I think this has to do with the COVID crisis and the incredible amount of money created and all the currency debasement. So we talk with high net worth clients every day, and many of them are getting very worried about the debasement of currency. And they follow us to invest in everything the government can't print. So bonds are getting quite dangerous. Well, you make a negative return guaranteed, almost guaranteed, if you buy bonds now. And of course, cash is getting. You shouldn't own too much cash, especially not in the bank, because with the negative interest rates and the high inflation numbers, you will lose purchasing power.
Yeah, I think your fund has assets under management of around 200 million euro. Is that right?
It's 200 million Canadian. It's 150 million euros.
Okay, I would think that in the coming years, with a commodity supercycle, you'll probably hit 1 billion AUM, and it's one to look out for. The Commodity Discovery Fund. I know we're going to wrap up very shortly, but when I was researching the books you've written, I wasn't aware that you'd written so many books, and it's amazing, it's very impressive. Most of them, I think, a lot of them are only in Dutch, so I probably didn't realize they were there because they hadn't been in English. But you've written about 8 books, is that right?
Yeah, actually, I've written 7 books, but I've been a photojournalist for the first 20 years of my life. So I also published a photo book about my work between 1980 and 2000. So that's the 8th book. And I also wrote 2 books out of these 7 books or 8 books are about the energy system. So I wrote The Tesla Revolution in 2014 and The Permanent Oil Crisis, which is a translation from the Dutch title, The Permanent Oil Crisis in 2008. So everything which is happening now in the world of energy actually is not a big surprise to me, because already in 2008 we learned that energy was really getting scarcer and scarcer, and the amount of energy needed for the 8 billion people in this world, that would become very tough to supply enough cheap energy. There's enough energy available, but there's not enough cheap energy available. And now we see that, and that's what's scary, but it's very interesting topic. I like to study that.
Yeah, and it has a big connection with oil, or gold as well, the oil-gold connection. And I saw that you wrote one which is very interesting to me. If I could get an English version, I'd read it straight away. Patterns of Deception about the US deep state. That was a surprise, but hopefully will get translated into English.
Well, I'm actually, we stopped working on an English translation because this topic is such a sensitive topic, and the world is so polarized now, and we had quite a bad reception in the Netherlands with a Dutch title. And people are really getting aggressive. That they're being lied to by their government. And sometimes the media is complicit, and often complicit without knowing they are complicit, but they're being fed lies times and again. I decided to concentrate on the financial economic topics and to also move away a bit from the mainstream media. I used to be a lot in the mainstream media on Dutch television, and I prefer to be on these type of podcasts now. So if people are not interested to hear my views, they won't see me. So only people who are looking for it, they can hear these kind of interviews.
Well, there's certainly a lot of developments in the financial and monetary sphere to warrant maybe another book in the future. Are you looking at writing another book?
I'm trying to keep myself away from the typewriter because I used to work day and night. I still work 12 hours a day on average. I try to keep my weekends off a bit. Last weekend I didn't succeed. And when you start to write on a new book, all your spare time goes into that book. And actually, my youngest son said this summer, Daddy, this is the holiday. You didn't work that much, so I'm still working during holidays. So I have a few book ideas, but I try not to work on it.
I think we'll wrap up now. So thank you very much, William, for your views on what's happening around the world right now and on the monetary system and on gold. I'm sure that as we even close off this conversation and look at the news, it will be changing rapidly. So there's a lot of material there for everybody to think about, and it's very great that you gave us your time today. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm always impressed by the huge amount of research you do for the stuff you write, and that has really helped me. I think I actually mentioned you in the Big Reset, so thanks for that.
Oh yeah, no problem. If you want in the future to tap me for information or research,